Hello, good morning, good afternoon. Um, Today I'm going to be presenting an evaluation of open source intelligence in the context of a digitally enabled society. So I'll just jump straight into it. I'll start with the introduction. So to explain, the whole focus of the presentation is to analyze, explain, and define open source intelligence and its role in intelligence collection, and to also evaluate open source intelligence. I will use the SWOT analysis method, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, with a primary focus on the digital impacts and ultimate intelligence principles. So a definition of open source intelligence, or OSINT as it is in the brackets, would probably be more simple to separate the open source and the intelligence. So open source information kind of refers to the type of information that is collected, while intelligence is obviously a type of data. It's processed data. Um, so this can include any open to the public sources of information in the media, on the internet, and any public government data. To turn the open source data into open source intelligence, one must take the data, analyze it, and turn it into a product which can then be disseminated. The same with any data types. There's nothing different there. Open source intelligence is a multi-factor, meaning qualitative and quantitative method for collecting and analyzing data, but also deciding whether to use open source data in public spaces can be used in an intelligence context. Open source data is mostly used and valued by intelligence analysts, national security, law enforcement, and sometimes large businesses who use non-sensitive data to solve cases and minimize the risks in day-to-day. So there are different types of open source data which are listed here. So there's public records, which they can include like academic papers or government records, or some professional databases. And news media, to give an example, open source intelligence, I think, was used in the Russian involvement in the downing of a Malaysian flight over Ukraine, and that was the news media was used in that. And then there's libraries, obviously images and videos, websites, and like I mentioned before, databases. But this can also include other intelligence collection types like social media, human, geographical, and signal intelligence. So pretty much how it works, there are different types of data collection tools. So there's something called an automated web scraping, which sounds pretty funky, but it just refers to the procedure of an automatic collection of data from websites using any specific software. I've listed here Rosenda, but there's like so many different versions. It's completely up to whoever's using them and whatever they prefer, I suppose. But it allows you to gather data in near real time, and it can also be used on the dark web as well, to collect data on like illicit activities and shady businesses. And then there's manual research, which I don't think needs too much explaining. It's pretty straightforward. And then there's the API integrations, which stands for Application Programming Interface. And then I've listed next to it the program that they use, the IRBIS. That's one of them anyway. And this allows for a more controlled way of data collection from online services. Some online websites allow analysts and developers to programmatically interact with their data. Projects also allow for an exact extraction of requested data from the API response and process that information according to the project's requirements. So it's more dense. The web scraping is a bit more broad, I think, in the way it uses data. And then there's the filter and the verification. This just includes the fact checking information and corroborating sources of data to avoid any misinformation. The analysis and interpretation. like identifying patterns in the data. As an example, there's like website traffic patterns during a specific time that could be used, I suppose. Finding trends and actionable intelligence. And then there's the dissemination, which includes reports or briefings for the decision makers. This is where the raw data can be used as evidence henceforth, as intelligence, pretty much. So a real world example of this is the Russian-Ukraine war. This will be mentioned throughout my presentation. I think it's a pretty good example. So open source analysts employ the use of satellite images, intercepted radio communications, and social media posts to track where troops are stationed and their movements in order to verify war crimes, pretty much. And then there's a quote here. It says, open source related community efforts publish their findings on the Twitter accounts, such as at GeoConfirmed. I think there are a few more as well. But they base their analysis on material depicting the movement of troops or materials that proves the destruction of military equipment. They also shape public narratives about the war. Prior to the full-scale incursion of Russian troops into Ukrainian territory on February 24th, open source posts highlighted the buildup of Russian military equipment and troops along the Ukrainian border during December 2021 and February 2022. This has likely contributed to the credibility of claims made by US intelligence agencies about a looming invasion. So it really does make a difference. The influence it has on modern intelligence is open source intelligence has been used since World War II, but it was never seen as important as it is today. Intelligence has always been a thing of secrecy, and secrecy has always been regarded as the most valuable. However, as society has adapted to a more public way of life, the use of open source intelligence has been reimagined. With the pairing of OSINT and modern technology comes a powerful intelligence tool. While the best source of intelligence would be all source intelligence, which means pretty much that open source intelligence should be paired with other intelligence sources, like the ones listed there, to become like the ultimate intelligence gathering source to increase the credibility and reliability. And then there's another quote. There is no progress in intelligence without cooperation between the public and the private sector. All of that is greatly embodied in open source intelligence. So open source intelligence in a digitally enabled society. There is increased data availability. So the increased popularity of social media, blogs, and online forums like Reddit and 4chan have significantly widened the data forms available to open source intelligence users. Governments, businesses, and individuals all share large amounts of information in public spaces, making modern intelligence gathering more accessible. The real-time intelligence allows for a more efficient assessment of emerging threats, like that of cybersecurity risks, terrorist movements, and activities and misinformation campaigns. The capability to analyze live data as it is happening allows for a better and quicker response, and ultimately a better informed decision making. So the use of AI with the emergence of AI, it's been found that AI has the ability to process large amounts of data very quickly. There's no surprise there, which detects any patterns in the data, any outliers that may have been missed by the human eye. This is particularly useful in cyber threat intelligence. So there's a challenge of the data overload, which means that obviously there are large amounts of public data out there, and this creates a difficult operation when filtering out all the relevant information that you want to keep. Analysts must differentiate between valuable information and noise while ensuring there is accuracy and reliability in a fast-paced work environment. So open source intelligence in relation to the intelligence cycle, it pretty much is the same as all the rest. So there's the determination of the best open source tools to use, which comes first. And then it moves on to monitoring social media forums, government reports, this is where the use of web scraping and API access happens. There is automated data regulation and translated languages here. Analysts remove any irrelevant data. The next stage is pattern recognition, risk assessment, and predictive modeling. This is where analysts can cross-reference data with human intelligence for validation. Reports, threat assessments, and briefings are being worked on at this stage as well. And then the final phase includes sharing intelligence with policymakers or operational units. Reports or alerts are used here. And then lastly, decision makers provide their feedback last. Okay, so a SWOT analysis of open source intelligence. So I'll go through these one by one. So the strengths, context giving. Pretty much open source intelligence is seen as like the leading source for figuring out a context in a sort of situation. Covert information is limited as they are specific in their nature. Open source intelligence is more versatile and can paint a broader idea of the question in hand. It also has the advantage of being able to see signs early on, like radicalization in online communities, and putting it above other intelligence sources. It is the most ethical technique to use out of all of the other intelligence sources, and therefore it is most appealing to the public. It's also very cost effective and time effective as well, meaning officers will not need a high clearance, which results in them having to have like more money, I suppose. And then the weaknesses are the legal and ethical challenges in data collection. Although open source intelligence is generated from open sources, it does not mean the data is public information. Like a lot of information, I suppose, gets leaked from private accounts and stuff. There have been considerations as to whether open source intelligence should be allowed to access private information through these public accounts. So the data reliability, most public information is not reviewed, which means misinformation can be overwhelming at times, as well as having fake news. And then the use of high-tech solutions. While technology has its advantages, it can't replicate a human brain. Human analysts are irreplaceable in regards to the comparison of evidence and thought processes leading up to any alternate hypotheses. The expertise of analysis cannot be replaced. And then you've got opportunities. So AI and machine learning can enhance open source intelligence analysis, and there is an increased digital footprint that helps with intelligence. And then the threats are government censorship, and information can be used in information warfare. And advisories use open source intelligence for counterintelligence. A pretty good example of that is probably Romania's latest general election. I think his name was Georgescu. He was using fake accounts on social media platforms like bots to generate more followers and create a kind of bigger platform for himself to gain votes. So the more popular he was, the more people would probably want to vote for him, I suppose, on social media. But then this all got found out to be, fake, and they were all bots, and so he ultimately lost the election and has been banned from trying again. I think recently, literally the other day, probably he got told that he can re-elect. So yeah, that's a pretty good example of that. So some other examples are cybersecurity. Open source intelligence is used to track hacker groups and can prevent cyber attacks. They can counter terrorism. Analysts can monitor social media to prevent any attacks and track extremist networks and forums. I've put in brackets there incels because that's the biggest phenomenon I can think of. which I think is pretty. I think this is used quite a lot with tracking down intel's forums. And then criminal investigations, like law enforcement can use open source intelligence to monitor illicit activities online, including on the dark web. So open source intelligence in global conflicts. I've done recent global conflicts because I suppose there's just so many going on in the world. It's hard to keep track. So in the USA, they employed open source intelligence to monitor Russian troops' whereabouts to identify war crimes happening. In Europe, they used it to counter Russia's information operations. And then in Ukraine, the most remembered use of open source intelligence is probably the use of facial recognition to try and identify any perpetrators of war crimes. Obviously, there are probably quite a lot of perpetrators, so I don't know how effective that would be, but the fact that they're using facial recognition in the first place is amazing. So, like I said, we'll come back to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, how it's being used. So I suppose that the Ukrainian government has been able to utilize commercial satellites, increasing their military situational awareness and their levels of surveillance. AI is also being used with commercial software to help with their efficiency of action. And there's a quote here that explained it pretty well, which says, Russia stated that its forces were redeploying away from the borders. Quickly, this was exposed by the open source community, which was able to show that not only were the troops still in place, but in fact what was happening was a redeployment of force in order to be able to better execute an invasion plan. I think that OSINT probably definitely helped with these situations. Open source intelligence has been able to counter Russia's information operations and Putin's blatant misinformation. Any false information sent out by the Russians were rebutted immediately and exposed to the public on social media and stuff. The power of information has made an incredible impact on the outcome of certain aspects of the war. So crowdsourcing has been a major help for Ukrainian troops, if not the best help that they've had. So chatbots have allowed Ukrainian citizens to report the location of Russian troops and units. They've been able to report it to Ukrainian troops, and the longer the war has been going on, the better they are at reporting it and using it, which is amazing. And I think this has really helped them. So operational intelligence has made a huge impact in informing global responses and policy making. Adopting open source intelligence in the contemporary digital era has significantly revolutionized intelligence collection and analysis. So to conclude my presentation, open source intelligence is crucial in intelligence work, especially in a digitally enabled society. Although there are more positives than negatives regarding open source intelligence, the negatives do have the power to create unfavorable outcomes. The digital era has presented many intelligence gathering opportunities, more so than ever. Social media has allowed for real-time analysis and monitoring, meaning the advancement of technology equates to the advancement of open source intelligence, and how these relations will further onto technological evolution of AI and machine learning, ultimately helping out with effectiveness and efficiency when it comes to collecting data. The use of open source intelligence has been vital in counterterrorism, which counterterrorism means around the world and will continue to strengthen as technology advances. This is only a positive for the development of actionable intelligence and cannot be overemphasized. This is my reference list, and that's about it. Thank you so much for listening. Yeah, thank you.